What if you're the monster and don't know it? Imagine this. You're sitting in a bright, sterile room. In front of you is a control panel, a large red button glowing faintly. A man in a white lab coat points to a stranger strapped into a chair behind a glass window. Then he turns to you and says, "This is just an experiment. Go ahead. Push the button." You hesitate. The man insists. You press it once. The person flinches. You hear them groan in pain. You look around, no alarms, no screaming, just calm instruction. "Keep going," he says. And so you do. Not because you're cruel, not because you want to hurt anyone, but because someone told you to. This isn't a thought experiment. It's real. The Milgram study, one of the most disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted. Over 65% of participants administered what they believed to be deadly electric shocks to a stranger simply because they were told to. Not by force, not with threats, but with quiet authority. So here's the question. What makes a good person do something terrible and not even realize it? We like to believe evil is obvious, that monsters are born with twisted minds and dark hearts, that it could never be us. But the truth is more unsettling. Evil doesn't arrive with fanfare. It creeps in slowly through 1,000 tiny compromises. It whispers, not screams. And most people don't hear it until it's too late. In this video, we're going to uncover the corruption cycle, a 5-stage psychological descent that transforms good people into participants in cruelty, sometimes without their awareness. From moral erosion to blind obedience, from tribal thinking to self-justification, and finally to the loss of empathy we call dehumanization. This is not just about history. It's about now, about the world you live in, about the choices we make when we think no one's watching. And if right now you're thinking, "I would never do that," you might already be at risk. Because the moment you believe you're immune is the moment you stop paying attention. So stay with me. For the next few minutes, we'll shine a light into the darker corners of human nature. Not to condemn it, but to understand it. Because that's the first step to resisting it. And who knows? You might just discover something you've been avoiding your whole life, that the monster doesn't live out there. It grows. In here. Moral erosion, the first crack in the mirror. No one wakes up and decides to become a monster. That's not how it works. The descent into darkness doesn't begin with violence or hatred. It begins with something far more subtle, something almost invisible. A choice so small, so easy to justify that you barely notice you've taken a step. It starts when you tell a lie to avoid trouble. When you look the other way at something you know is wrong. When you let someone else get hurt because standing up for them would be inconvenient. It starts when you say to yourself, "It's no big deal. Everyone does it." This is moral erosion, the first crack in the mirror of your integrity. And it doesn't feel like much. That's the danger. Because nothing terrible happens right away. The world doesn't punish you. No alarms go off. And so your brain learns a dangerous lesson. Psychologists call this process cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension we feel when our actions don't align with our values. But instead of admitting that we did something wrong, the mind often takes a shortcut. It rewrites the story. It tells us what we want to hear. I had no choice. It wasn't really that bad. I'm still a good person. These small justifications add up, and each time we use one, our moral boundaries shift ever so slightly. What once seemed unthinkable begins to feel normal. And what's worse, we become less sensitive to the discomfort. The more we lie to ourselves, the easier it becomes to live with the lie. This isn't just theory. It plays out every day in boardrooms, in relationships, in government. The Watergate scandal started with a small break-in, but it was the cascade of cover-ups that destroyed lives. Enron's financial disaster began with minor accounting tricks until it evolved into a full-scale fraud. And in times of war, some of history's worst atrocities began with soldiers told to simply follow orders, tiny steps that led to mass suffering. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo called this the slippery slope of evil. Once you take the first step, your reference point shifts, and each new step feels justifiable compared to the last. You're not leaping into darkness, you're sliding into it. That's why the most dangerous phrase anyone can say is, "I would never do that." Because moral erosion doesn't happen to bad people. It happens to people who don't pay attention to the first crack, who don't realize that a small lie today can become a big betrayal tomorrow. So ask yourself, where in your life are you justifying something you once believed was wrong? What story are you telling yourself to feel better about it? Because the moment we excuse a small wrong for the sake of convenience, approval, or personal gain, that's the moment the mirror begins to break. Obedience to authority when conscience bows. Most people believe they control their own actions, that their sense of right and wrong is unshakable. But history and psychology tells us something much more uncomfortable. Under the right circumstances, even the most well-intentioned person can become an instrument of harm. And often, all it takes is a voice of authority. In the early 1960s, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted what would become one of the most chilling experiments in behavioral science. Participants were told they were helping with a memory and learning study. Their task? To deliver electric shocks to another person each time that person answered a question incorrectly. With each mistake, the voltage increased. The learner, of course, was an actor. But the participants didn't know that. As the shocks escalated, the actor screamed in pain, begged to be released, eventually fell silent. And yet, under the calm pressure of a man in a white lab coat saying, "Please continue," the experiment requires it. 65% of participants went all the way to the highest voltage, 450 volts. They didn't scream. They didn't protest. They simply obeyed. And when later asked why, many gave the same answer: "I was just doing what I was told." This is the terrifying power of obedience. It can override empathy. It can silence the conscience. And it can make an ordinary person do something that, under any other circumstances, would horrify them. We see this pattern again and again, not just in labs, but in real life. At the Nuremberg trials, Nazi officers stood in court and repeated one haunting phrase: "I was just following orders." These weren't monsters in the classical sense. Many were fathers, neighbors, educated professionals. What changed wasn't their character, it was the context. A system that demanded obedience and punished doubt. In 1968, during the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, American soldiers, some barely out of high school, slaughtered hundreds of unarmed civilians, including children. The ones who pulled the triggers weren't psychopaths. They were following orders. In corporate offices today, employees often carry out unethical actions not because they want to, but because it's expected. They meet quotas, hit targets, satisfy higher-ups. They don't feel responsible. After all, someone else signed the directive. Milgram's experiment showed us something we didn't want to see, that the sense of duty, once weaponized, can become a blindfold. And this blindness is reinforced by culture. From childhood, we are trained to obey parents, teachers, bosses, governments. We learn that questioning authority is dangerous, even shameful. But if we never question, we stop thinking. We stop feeling. We become tools. So ask yourself, would you still act the same if no one told you to? Would you still do it if no one was watching? If history remembered your choice, how would you be judged? Because obedience without conscience is not loyalty. It's surrender. And as we'll see in the next part, that surrender doesn't just come from above. Sometimes it comes from around you, from the group you belong to. The power of group identity, us à vis. Them begins here. Human beings are wired to belong. From the moment we're born, we seek tribes, families, friend circles, teams, communities. Belonging isn't just comforting, it's survival. For most of human history, being part of a group meant protection from predators, from starvation, from death. But there's a darker side to this instinct. Because the moment we identify with a group, we start to draw a line between us and them. It doesn't take much. In one of the most famous social psychology experiments, British researcher Henry Tajfel brought strangers into a room and randomly divided them into two groups based on nothing more than a coin toss. No history, no reason, no rivalry. Just arbitrary teams. And yet, within minutes, participants started favoring their own group, offering more money, more support, even expressing subtle hostility toward the other side. Why? Because once a group identity is formed, our brains shift into tribal mode. Loyalty to us becomes a virtue. Suspicion of them becomes natural. Now magnify that with something real: race, religion, politics, nationality. And you'll see how powerful and dangerous this force becomes. Throughout history, every major atrocity has followed the same psychological blueprint. Label a group. Strip away their humanity. Blame them for your suffering. Then watch what people become capable of. In Nazi Germany, Jews were called rats. In Rwanda, Tutsis were labeled cockroaches. In the American South, enslaved Africans were reduced to property. These words weren't just insults, they were tools of dehumanization. And once someone is seen as less than human, harming them no longer feels wrong. It feels justified. This isn't ancient history. It's still happening. Look at modern politics. Opponents aren't just people with different views. They're called traitors, scum, or worse. On social media, people don't engage with ideas, they attack characters, dehumanize strangers with a few keystrokes. Cancel culture, online mobs, comment section wars, they're all symptoms of the same trap, us versus them. And once this mindset takes hold, morality doesn't just fade, it gets twisted. Compassion becomes weakness. Questioning becomes betrayal. Empathy becomes selective. And here's the terrifying part: it feels good. Being part of a group gives us identity, purpose, a sense of being right. We stop thinking critically because the group does the thinking for us. And that's how ordinary people like you and me, can become soldiers in moral wars we never question. So the next time you hear someone say they're all the same, or those people are the problem, pause. Ask who benefits from this division, and what truth might be hidden behind this simple narrative. Because when you divide the world into us and them, you're not just choosing a side. You're choosing what part of your humanity you're willing to abandon. Self-justification: how the mind lies to itself. No one wants to believe they're the villain. Even the worst criminals in history saw themselves as justified as protectors, saviors, patriots, or heroes. That's the unsettling truth. The mind will go to incredible lengths to protect the image we have of ourselves as good. This is the power of self-justification, the quiet, relentless force that allows people to do harm while still believing they're doing good. At the heart of this process lies cognitive dissonance. When our actions clash with our values, it creates a mental discomfort. And instead of admitting fault, the brain often rewrites the story. I had no choice. They deserved it. It was for the greater good. These aren't just excuses. They're survival strategies for our self-image. Because guilt is heavy. Shame is crushing. And the deeper someone goes into morally questionable behavior, the more creative the mind becomes at explaining it away. History is filled with chilling examples. During the Inquisition, people were tortured and burned not by sadists, but by men who believed they were saving souls. In the 20th century, political purges killed millions, all under the banner of cleansing society. In war, soldiers dropped bombs on civilian targets, believing they're protecting freedom. It's not that these people didn't feel the weight of their actions. It's that their minds worked overtime to make those actions feel necessary. This is where morale licensing comes in, a strange psychological phenomenon, where doing something good gives us permission to do something bad. A person donates to charity, then cheats on their taxes. A leader fights for justice, then silences dissent, believing the cause is worth it. The scariest part? We all do this. A student cheats on a test, but says, I studied hard, I deserve this. A parent yells at their child, then thinks, I'm just trying to teach them discipline. An employee sabotages a coworker and justifies it as standing up for myself. One lie, one act, one rationalization, and we start seeing ourselves not as flawed but as justified. The descent continues, not through obvious evil, but through subtle storytelling. Self-justification doesn't require malice. It just requires one simple belief. I'm a good person. So whatever I did must be okay. So how do we fight this? Start by noticing discomfort. That tension you feel when something doesn't sit right, that's your soul speaking. Don't silence it. Don't explain it away. Instead, ask, am I being honest or just trying to protect how I see myself? Because the moment we stop being brutally honest with ourselves is the moment we start becoming someone we swore we'd never be. Dehumanization, the point of no return. There's a moment in every great atrocity when the unthinkable becomes possible. A moment when a human being looks at another and no longer sees a person, but a thing. A problem. An enemy. An object to be removed. This is dehumanization. And it is the final, most dangerous stage of the corruption cycle. You see, the human brain is built for empathy. When we see someone stub their toe or hear a baby cry, our mirror neurons fire. We feel their pain as if it were our own. That's what makes cruelty hard for most of us. It hurts to hurt others. But there's a loophole in our psychology. If we stop seeing someone as fully human, that empathy switch turns off. Throughout history, this trick of the mind has been used to justify war, slavery, genocide, and everyday cruelty. In Nazi Germany, Jewish people were called rats. In Rwanda, the Tutsi were labeled cockroaches. During American slavery, black people were described as property, not as people. In each case, language came first. Language that turned people into something less than human, less than worthy, less than real. And once that perception takes hold, there is no moral boundary left. You can't violate the rights of someone you no longer see as having any. This isn't ancient history. You can see it today on your phone, in your newsfeed, in the way people talk online. Scroll through social media. Look at the way people speak to strangers. They don't argue, they attack. They don't debate, they destroy. People aren't disagreeing with ideas anymore. They're tearing down identities. They're mocking, threatening, canceling. And why? Because once someone is labeled as the other, a troll, a bigot, a snowflake, a sheep, empathy becomes optional. Dehumanization online feels different, but it's the same cycle. A stranger becomes a profile picture. A comment becomes a target. And suddenly, hurting someone feels like sport, not violence. We saw this in the Stanford prison experiment. Within days, college students assigned to be guards began humiliating and abusing their fellow students just because they were labeled prisoners. They didn't see friends. They saw roles. And roles are easy to punish. This is what makes dehumanization so terrifying. It doesn't require hate. It only requires distance. Once that emotional distance sets in, we don't flinch. We fire. We silence. We strip away names, faces, stories. And all that's left is control. So how do we resist this? Start with language. Whenever you hear someone described as a parasite, a rat, a cockroach, a threat, pause. That's not just rhetoric. That's psychological groundwork for something much worse. Next, refuse to reduce. Behind every label is a human being. Someone with memories, fear, pain, and hope. Because the moment we stop seeing each other as human, we become capable of anything. And the descent into darkness is no longer a possibility. It's already happening. History repeats, monsters are not born, they are made. When we look back at history's darkest chapters, the genocides, the purges, the wars, it's easy to assume the worst acts were committed by monsters. That only the heartless, the insane, the broken could do something so cruel. But history tells a different story. Time and again, the people who carried out unthinkable horrors weren't sociopaths or sadists. They were teachers, clerks, shopkeepers, neighbors. They were people who once held their children in their arms, who played music, who believed in God, who cried at funerals. They were, in every sense, just like us. And that's what makes this truth so terrifying. Monsters are not born. They are made by systems, by silence, and by slow psychological descent. Think back to the stages we've explored. It starts with moral erosion, a harmless lie, a small betrayal. Then comes obedience following orders without question. Then group identity, drawing a line between us and them. Then self-justification, reframing cruelty as duty. And finally, dehumanization, where empathy dies and brutality becomes justified. This isn't just a theory. It's a pattern. It happened in Nazi Germany, where millions of citizens participated in a regime of extermination not because they were evil, but because they were conditioned to believe they were protecting their country. It happened in Rwanda, where neighbors turned against each other, slaughtering over 800,000 people in just 100 days. These were not trained killers. They were farmers. They were husbands. And yet, once propaganda took hold, once the other became a cockroach, the blade no longer trembled. It happened in the United States, too. During the My Lai massacre, young American soldiers murdered hundreds of Vietnamese civilians. Women, children, the elderly. When asked why, many said, "We were just following orders." And it happens now in quieter ways. In corporate boardrooms where fraud is justified as strategy. In online mobs where real people are reduced to usernames and destroyed. In political systems where dissenters are dehumanized and truth is optional. These aren't anomalies. They are symptoms. Symptoms of a deeper truth that, under the right conditions, anyone can fall into the cycle. Not because they are broken, but because they are human. That's why we must stop asking, how could they do that? And start asking, how might I be vulnerable to the same thing? Because the descent into darkness is not a single decision. It's a path walked slowly, step by step, excuse by excuse, until one day you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the person staring back. The lesson of history is not about what others did. It's about what you might do if you ever stopped paying attention. The psychological blueprint, why this happens to everyone. So how does this happen? How do good, moral, caring people become participants, sometimes even perpetrators, of cruelty? The answer isn't that they were broken. It's that they were human. You see, every stage in the corruption cycle, moral erosion, obedience, tribalism, self-justification, dehumanization, is not some bizarre glitch in our psychology. These are built in survival mechanisms. They were designed by evolution to protect us, to help us adapt in a dangerous world. Start with moral erosion. Why do we justify small wrongs? Because our brains are wired to avoid pain, especially emotional pain. Admitting we did something wrong creates guilt and shame, which threaten our sense of identity. So the brain does what it must to preserve stability. It rewrites the story. Then comes obedience to authority. For most of human history, survival meant following the tribe, obeying leaders. If you challenged the chief, you might get exiled or killed. So we evolved to comply, to trust power, to defer judgment in favor of the group's judgment. It kept us alive until it didn't. Now look at group identity. Humans are social creatures. Belonging to a tribe meant protection. Being isolated meant death. So we developed strong instincts to bond with our in-group and to distrust outsiders. That's why tribalism feels so natural. Why we rally around flags, faiths, sports teams, ideologies. It fills a deep need. But it also creates the perfect condition for us Vs, them thinking to flourish. Self-justification is a cognitive shortcut. The brain can't carry the weight of constant moral questioning, so it invents reasons. Justifications, stories. They don't have to be true. They just have to feel good. This helps us maintain psychological balance while quietly compromising who we are. And finally, dehumanization. perhaps the most chilling mechanism of all. When faced with a threat, especially a social or existential one, our brains may suppress empathy to allow for action. That means, once someone is perceived as the enemy, the circuits that allow us to feel their pain go offline. This isn't a conscious choice. It's instinct. It helped our ancestors survive, but today, it opens the door to unthinkable harm. None of these behaviors were designed for evil. They're the result of evolution trying to solve a brutal equation. How do I stay safe? How do I stay accepted? How do I avoid shame, exile, or death? But in the modern world where power is complex, information is distorted, and morality is not black and white, these ancient instincts can be hijacked, weaponized, turned inward, turned against others. That's why this isn't a warning for bad people. It's a wake-up call for all people. Because the question is no longer, how could someone do that? It's, how do I stop myself from doing the same, even unknowingly? Understanding this blueprint is the first step. But it's not enough. Because insight without action is just another story we tell ourselves. Radical self-awareness, the only antidote. By now, you may be feeling uncomfortable, maybe even disturbed. That's good. That means you're paying attention. Because the most dangerous belief you can hold, the one that guarantees your descent into darkness, is simple: I would never do that. That sentence isn't a shield. It's a blindfold. The truth is, we are all vulnerable. The moment we assume we're above corruption is the moment we stop noticing it creeping into our thoughts, our choices, our compromises. And when we stop noticing, we stop resisting. So what's the antidote? Radical self-awareness. Not passive reflection. Not vague mindfulness. But active, uncomfortable, brutally honest self-inquiry. It starts with simple questions. Am I justifying something I once said I'd never tolerate? Am I staying silent because it's easier? Would I still do this if no one told me to? This isn't about guilt-tripping yourself. It's about checking your inner compass daily. Because in a world full of subtle pressures, your values will not defend themselves. You have to guard them. You have to confront yourself before circumstances do. Carl Jung called this confrontation shadow work. The process of meeting the parts of yourself you'd rather ignore. The ego doesn't like it. It wants to believe we're always the hero of the story. But Jung warned, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Because when we look inward with honesty, we don't just find strength. We find fear, rage, envy, the same forces that drive the corruption cycle. And yet here's the paradox. Only those who dare to face their darkness can truly walk in light. Self-awareness isn't comfortable, but it's freeing. It gives you space between stimulus and response. It gives you the pause that obedience tries to erase. It gives you the courage to say, no, this isn't who I want to be. But awareness alone isn't enough. You need accountability. Surround yourself with people who challenge you. Not echo chambers. Not yes men. People who hold mirrors to your behavior, not just your words. And practice empathy not just with others, but with yourself. Because if you can't face your own flaws with compassion, you'll be too ashamed to admit them. And shame, unacknowledged, becomes the soil where cruelty grows. This isn't easy. In fact, it may be the hardest work you'll ever do, but it's also the most necessary. Because the world doesn't need more opinions. It needs more people who are willing to confront their own reflection and still choose to act with integrity. That is the only real defense against the corruption cycle. Not purity, not pride, but a relentless commitment to self-awareness. Modern monsters, social media, cancel culture, and digital dehumanization. You don't need to look to history books or war zones to see the corruption cycle in action. You only need to open your phone. In the digital world, the entire descent, moral erosion, blind obedience, group identity, self-justification, dehumanization plays out in real time millions of times a day. And the most terrifying part? We think it's normal. Start with moral erosion. You see a rumor. You share it without checking. You mock a stranger. You leave a hateful comment because they deserve it. You scroll past cruelty with a shrug. Small actions, minor infractions. But each one chips away at your moral compass. Bit by bit, the standards you once held become flexible. It's just online. It's not that serious. Then comes obedience, not to a boss in a white lab coat, but to the algorithms. The trending topics. The echo chambers that reward rage and punish silence. You're told, react, respond, destroy. And if you don't, you're irrelevant, forgotten, invisible. Group identity? It's stronger than ever. Every bio, every post, every hashtag declares a side. And once you choose a side, the other becomes your enemy. The moment someone disagrees, they're not just wrong, they're dangerous, toxic, evil. They're not like us. This is where self-justification thrives. You post something cruel, but convince yourself they asked for it. You pile onto someone's shame, but say, I'm standing up for justice. You silence voices, but call it protecting the truth. You don't feel like the villain. You feel like the hero. Because your actions are framed in the language of righteousness. And that is the most dangerous language of all. Then, inevitably, comes dehumanization. Online, people aren't people. They're avatars, usernames, profile pictures. It's easy to insult a face you'll never see, to mock a pain you'll never feel, to destroy someone you'll never meet. Empathy doesn't stand a chance when there's no eye contact, no pause, no voice trembling in real time. Cancel culture becomes spectacle. Harassment becomes entertainment. Outrage becomes currency. And we're all participating, not because we're evil, but because we're disconnected from each other and from ourselves. And that disconnection, multiplied across millions of interactions, is how modern monsters are made. So ask yourself, when you're online, do you still see people or just content? Do you still pause to wonder what someone's life might be like? Or have you become numb to their humanity? Because the digital world doesn't just reflect who we are. It accelerates who we're becoming. And if we're not careful, it will condition us to believe that cruelty is courage, that destruction is justice, and that silence is weakness. But it doesn't have to be that way. Because in every moment, on every screen, we still have a choice: to remember the human behind the post, and to refuse the invitation to become less than one ourselves. The thin line between the human and the monster. There's a line between good and evil, but it doesn't run between nations, or political parties, or belief systems. It runs right through the middle of every human heart. That line is thin, and if you're not looking carefully, you might not even notice when you've crossed it. We all like to believe we're on the right side. That if we lived in another era, we would have been the one hiding refugees, the one speaking out against injustice, the one resisting cruelty. But the truth is, you don't know, because heroism is not a matter of belief. It's a matter of behavior under pressure, under fear, under doubt. And the path to becoming something you swore you'd never be doesn't start with hate. It starts with apathy, with silence, with one small step in the wrong direction and no one to stop you. What you've seen in this video, the corruption cycle, it's not a warning from history. It's a map of the present. It's in the way we talk, the way we follow, the way we divide, the way we justify, and the way we forget that everyone was once somebody's child. The world doesn't need more good intentions. It needs people who are awake, who question themselves before they question others, who are willing to say, I don't trust myself completely, and that's why I must stay vigilant. So here's the real challenge. Can you hold on to your humanity even when no one else around you is? Can you resist the seduction of belonging when it asks you to abandon empathy? Can you be brave enough not just to fight monsters, but to face the part of yourself that could become one? Because that's where real courage lives. Not in battle, not in power, but in the quiet choice you make when no one is watching. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we break the cycle. Not by pretending we're above it, but by seeing it clearly and choosing again and again not to be consumed by it. Thank you for staying until the end. If this video moved something in you, don't let it end here. Start a conversation. Look inward and ask yourself, honestly, what will I do differently now that I know this?